I think Professor
Hello.
Dominelli has joined us. Hello,
Yes.
ma'am. Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
Yes,
Okay. So we'll have a very brief inaugural session before you start the lecture. It's just 5 to 10 minutes. Is that fine with you?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you, Rashma.
Okay.
Nice to meet you face to face at last.
Yes, definitely. It's very nice to meet you face to face. Nikhil, namku session start ചെയ്തിട്ട് record ചെയ്യാൻ like we will start the recording once the session starts. Now people are just joining. So
Yeah.
just wait like 5 to 10 minutes and then we will start the recording.
Okay.
Once I think the Vice Chancellor has also joined us. Josare, shall we begin the session?
Good evening.
Good evening. Okay.
Good evening.
Good evening, sir. Joseph, can we start the session?
Yeah. Okay. I had a phone call with Jayaraj sir, and he has joined.
Yes.
Good evening, Lena ma'am.
Dr. Jules Anthony is the head of the department, and Professor Jayaraj is the Vice Chancellor of our university. And all of you know
Nominally is our key speaker today, and she is from Sterling University, and she is a senior professor there, and she was also heading the International Association of Schools of Social Work. And she is a very well-known social worker cum academia in the sector internationally.
Thank you.
So welcome, ma'am.
Thank you.
Welcome, sir.
Nice to be here with you all, and nice to meet you.
Yeah, that's a great thing.
So should we wait?
No, I think we shall begin with the proceedings, Reshma.
Okay, so Amrita.
Jayaraj sir, shall we begin?
Yeah, we can begin.
We can begin with, I think, because we have only limited time now.
Amrita.
Okay. Yes.
Hello, Amrita. Can you start now?
Sorry, are you waiting for me to start?
No, ma'am. No, we have
No.
a small inaugural function. Our Vice Chancellor will do a inaugural talk, and then we will go to the keynote address.
Yeah, that's what I thought, but I just wanted to check.
We have a student we have a third semester student to do the compiling, and we are just waiting for her to come and do the compiling process.
That's fine. I just have to apologize that I have a hoarse voice, so I'll be drinking tea and water a lot.
No problem, man. Carry on. No problem.
Okay.
Even I'm tested positive and on home quarantine for last 4 or 5 days. Many of us are positive here in Kerala.
Well, that's not good, but
but no other way. It goes like. Reshma, what happened to Amrita?
No, Amrita will just begin.
Yeah, okay. Otherwise, we will have some other arrangement go on.
No, she's about to begin.
Yeah, okay, that would be great.
Shall we begin?
Yeah,
yes,
definitely,
please.
Amrita. Carry on.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah. Yes.
Good evening, everyone. It gives me immense pleasure to extend you a very warm welcome on behalf of Department of Social Work, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kalari, for the international webinar Aloft on the theme Dislocations and Fragmented Identities, Social Work Responses. The 5-day international webinar will be addressing the dilemmas of dislocations and identities that the social work practitioners and people addressed by social work practices experience. The word social work is a profession that is intimately connected with both the larger political, social, and economic structures, as well as with the daily personal experiences of the people. The identity or the categorizations that social scientific knowledge generate about the people dislocating, or which the social workers rely upon, becomes very crucial in understanding the problems and shaping the policy and strategies. This is a conflicting terrain, with different outlook might lead to different intervention strategies. We are asking the question how and when dislocations lead to differences in identity, or does it stay stable? Who decides such identities? What processes are involved in it? How does social work as a profession try to address such issues on dislocations, movement, and identities? I would now request Ms. Safa Keke to please welcome our distinguished guests and participants to this webinar. Safa, over to you.
Am I audible?
Yes, Safa, you are.
Okay. So today marks the inaugural session of Aloft, international webinar on dislocations and fragmented identities, social work responses. Greetings to one and all gathered here. It gives me tremendous contentment to be presenting the welcome speech among the most esteemed personalities who've won accolades in their respective fields. Honorable Vice Chancellor of our university, Dr. MK Jayaraj, has joined for inaugurating the session. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome you, sir. On behalf of the institution, I would like to welcome the speaker of the day, Professor Lena Dominelli. We're truly delighted with your presence, ma'am. Next, I welcome head of the department, Professor Jules Anthony, sir. And I'd also like to welcome our moderator for the session, Assistant Professor Dr. Reshma Bharadwaj. Against the backdrop, we've assembled here to listen and discuss to the eminent speaker of the day. I welcome everyone who've gathered here for the same. Thank you.
Now I would like to introduce our head of the department and the president of the meeting, Dr. Jules Anthony. He's the president of the Association of Schools of Social Work in Kerala. He has 25 years of postgraduate teaching and training experience in the social work education sector. He is also an approved research gate of both Mahatma Gandhi University and Sri Shankaracharya University. He serves at different universities as the member of the chairman of various academic administration boards and councils. He has published many books along with more than 25 research-based articles in various professional journals and magazines. It is my absolute pleasure to call upon Head of the Department of Social Work, Professor Dr. Jules Anthony, to deliver the presidential address.
Good evening to all. Thank you, Amrita, for inviting me to do the presidential address. Respected Jayaraj sir, Honorable Lena Dominelli ma'am, Reshma, and all other distinguished faculty members and participants in this international webinar on Dislocations and Fragmented Identities, Social Work Response, organized by the Department of Social Work, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit. A very warm good evening to everyone in this platform. I'm really happy and delighted to be here in this platform, to be a part of this international webinar organized by our department. In fact, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, Kerala, has completed its 25 years of existence, and the Department of Social Work also have finished its Jubilee year. When we really started with the Jubilee year, we had a very ambitious plan to have an international conference offline to be conducted in the university. And this topic on dislocations and fragmented identities were discussed then and there. And we were waiting to organize an international conference with all its vigor. But unfortunately, this pandemic conditions and other socio-economical conditions have made us to be on this altered platform, that is the new blended system of online platform, we are organizing this international conference. Aloft is the word we have chosen as the title of this conference. Aloft is basically being uprooted or taken into the air. And the theme of this conference is basically dislocations and fragmented identities and how social work is responding to it. We have our Vice Chancellor, Dr. MK Jayaraj sir, who is also the basically the Vice Chancellor of Calicut University and also taking care of Sanskrit University right now. And he has gracefully consented to inaugurate the conference. So we welcome you, sir, to this program and also to the this activity of the Department of Social Work as the inaugurator. We have an eminent speaker, Dr. Lena Dominelli, who is a senior professor in University of Stirling, Scotland. And I think in the social work scenario internationally, she doesn't need any sort of introduction because that much established is her academic career. And we have Reshma, who has taken all the pain to take up this conference into this shape and making the concept note, as well as making all the key persons located, contacted, and organized with a team of our faculty members, as well as a students group. And finally, we have come to the inaugural ceremony today. And I really congratulate everyone for making this process coming up to this level. And also, I would like to put a word on this theme. Identity is basically the experience of anybody to be being identified, located, recognized, accepted, heard, considered with dignity. It's everybody's right to be heard, to be identified with a dignified respect, because every human being, not only human being, every existence on this universe has got this dignified existence to be identified and located. But unfortunately, in the contemporary world, what we are experiencing is identities are being dislocated, or we really experience dislocated identities, fragmented identities in that way. Fragmentation is an experience of being told, being rooted out, being taken off, being questioned, being questioned with our fundamental existence. We have different experiences of this type of identity being questioned and threatened in the social system. We have dislocations due to migrations, communal rights, military engagements, or political intrusions, or natural calamities, different situations, economic crisis and all. We also experience with the different type of existential questions with the psychiatric issues, mental health issues, or we also experience with developmental abnormalities. We experience with micro or unrecognized genders or identities like transgenders, or trivial identities in the peripheries of the social system. Always when we look into the social fabric, what we understand, or in the social order, what we understand is basically the people who are in the mainstream are always having the identity concept. And people who are in the peripheries are one way or other way experience the fragmented feel, the toad feel of their identity. So the theme we are discussing about, or we are focusing on, what social work in the macro context is doing well. We have different levels of intervention. We intervene with the individuals, we intervene with the groups, we work with the communities, we work with the international scenario also now. So as a discipline and as a profession, we are engaging with the social work system. So this 5 days conference is basically focusing on different dimensions and experiences of the different people on earth, including the non-human existences. And we are asking how this fundamental fragmented feel of being, fragmented feel of identity is experienced by people, being addressed by people, and being managed by the systems. What governments are doing, what welfare systems are doing, what social work as a profession is doing, what academia is doing, what the industry is doing, what the social institutions are contributing in managing the dislocations and fragmented experiences faced by the humanity and the entire existence on the universe due to various socio-cultural, political, environmental dynamics. And what social work will be able to contribute in managing and making human existence much more identified and dignified. This is the question we are posing through this conference. So I welcome everyone to deliberate on, discuss on, and take our perspectives really heard, and we move on to make our identities much more respected, accepted, and established, though people are in the peripheries. Not only it's a prerogative of the people who are in the mainstream, everyone, irrespective of the caste, creed, color, culture, education, locations, politics, everyone has got this right to be to be with the identity. So let us think like this and deliberate on this platform. I thank everyone who has joined with us to deliberate on this, specifically Dr. Jayaraj sir, Lena Dominelli, and all other distinguished speakers who have agreed to come, and all the people who have contributed through their abstracts and papers to this conference. We welcome everyone, and we thank everyone in advance for being with us. And we expect a great, wonderful intellectual as well as academic discourse throughout these days. The second part of the conference will be in first week of February, where we will have 4 days of continuous presentations as well as with the paper presentations in the breakout rooms also. So we look forward very positively and very hopefully to have wonderful academic experiences with us. Thank you. Welcome everyone.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for talking with us. We have today with us Professor Dr. MK Jayaraj. He is the Calicut Vice Chancellor and is at present also was Chancellor in charge of Sri Shankaracharya University for the inauguration of Aloft. Dr. Jayaraj has been a visiting scientist to EMEA, Italy during 1994 to 95. He was awarded European Commission Fellowship to work at the University of Pierre and Marie Curie during 1995 to 96. He worked at Oregon State University, where he was involved in the development of P-type transparent conducting oxides. His specialization and research focus in the area of optoelectronic materials and devices. Let me now invite Dr. Jayaraj for the inaugural speech. Over to you, sir.
Good evening, President of the function, Dr. Jules Anthony. Today's resource person, Professor Lena Dominelli. Coordinator of the program, Dr. Reshma Bharadwaj. My dear students and participants. It's a very happy occasion to join the international webinar, Aloft, organized by the Department of Social Welfare, Sri Shankara University of Sanskrit. The Department of Social Welfare celebrated its Silver Jubilee 2 years back. The department has brought many laurels to the university. I congratulate the organizers for organizing this webinar. And as all of you know, social work is all about people. Social work focuses on helping people to overcome difficult challenges in their life. And the present world is going through the pandemic, and students of social work has more responsibility than others to help the people to overcome this difficult situation. And at the time of challenges and difficulties, always hope, which is the humanity has always relied upon hope. And let us hope that the near future will come to normal. The social work include helping people with poverty, addiction, unemployment, disability, abuse, mental illness, and many others. And if you look in Kerala, we have a growing aging population because of the increase of life expectancy, especially in Kerala. which is as good as that of developed countries, we are also facing problems. So social work students have an additional responsibility to help the people with the aging population. And also look the number of students with learning disabilities, especially those with the Down syndrome. There is an added responsibility of students, those working in social work, to cope with the situation. You have to adjust. The family has to adjust with the situation of students have Down syndrome. Many opportunities are challenging. Challenges are awaiting for the students who has opted a career in the field of social work. And today we have the topic of discussion, which is dislocations and fragmented identity, social work responses. As all of you know, the dislocations always happens because of the unrest, maybe the social calamities, or maybe because of the natural calamities. There is always dislocation, and this lose the people's identity, and this is one of the biggest problem which humanity has to face. And I hope that the international webinar Aloft will give the students an opportunity to discuss many of the problems which is faced by the humanity. I'm not prolonging more. With all your permission, I declare this international webinar Aloft inaugurated. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. I will now take this opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Lena Dominelli. Professor Lena holds a chair in social work at Durham University of Stirling in Scotland and director of the Disaster Interventions and Humanitarian Aid Program. She was previously co-director at the Institute of Hazards, Risk and Resilience at Durham University. She has specific interest in projects on climate change and extreme weather events, including drought, floods, cloud saps, wildfires, earthquake, volcanic eruptions, disaster interventions, vulnerability and resilience, community engagement, co-prediction, and participatory action research, alongside her interest in anti-oppressive practice. Her research projects include funding from ESRC, EPSRC, NERC, and the Department of International Development and Wellcome Trust. Lena is a prolific writer and has published widely in social work, social policy, and sociology. Some of the books are Anti-Oppressive Social Work, Green Social Work, Feminist Social Work, Practicing Social Work in Complex World, etc. She currently chairs the ISSW Committee on Disaster Interventions, Climate Change, and Sustainability, and has represented the social work profession at the United Nations discussions on climate change since 2010, including COP26 in Glasgow recently. She has received various honors for her work. The session will be moderated by Dr. Reshma Bharadwaj. Dr. Reshma Bharadwaj is an eminent social worker and well-known activist of Kerala in the area of gender-related issue. She completed her MSW from Rajagiri Institute of Social Sciences, Cochin, and awarded with PhD from University of Bergen, Norway. She has written, published many books and articles. Currently, she is working with Department of Social Work, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi. Let me invite Dr. Reshma to lead the session. Ma'am, please.
Thank you, Amrita. And I'm very happy that our session has started. So I won't prolong the moderator part of the talk. We'll directly go to Lena Dominelli's listen to the Lena Dominelli's lecture. But before that, just one moment. Honorable Vice Chancellor, Joseph, teachers and social workers. So once again, a very warm welcome to Professor Lena Dominelli. Professor Dominary is and has always been a very vibrant and transforming influence in social work discipline. I remember when I joined the university as a new teacher, whenever I was confused about any underlying theoretical debates in social work and wanted to discuss with my students the ethical and practical issues that practitioners are confronting in the field, I used to go through the works of Professor Dominary. So I get this very warm, very condensed sort of feeling sitting here about to listen and interact with the Lena Dominelli. This is something possible because of this COVID breakdown and the new technologies that is given to us. Like if you're thinking about the times that we are living, there is a virus which sort of reflects the theme of our webinar. It's a virus which is roaming around happily, getting transformed every day, taking up newer and new identities, whereas the government and health system is trying to confine and seclude the people. So suddenly from citizens we get stuck into this single identity of potential coronavirus carriers. So there is this sort of paradox that is happening, and how as citizens, how can we deal with such issues when there are people, very vulnerable people who get completely victimized and suffer very indignities due to this fixing of certain fixed identities. And since time is very crucial for all of us, I won't go into the webinar concept in detail. Identity as a fixed notion has already been questioned in the social science literature. In fact, the last few decades we had seen intense theoretical debates about the identity, with concept like strategic essentialism from Gayatri Chakravarti, Spivak, to intersectional analysis and multiple identities, and many more. And these are not just theoretical debates, but they also reflected the dilemmas and questions that emerged from the political voices and movements from all over the world. So how does our discipline, our social work discipline, respond to such criticism, such voices? That's something that we are trying to address in this seminar. Is there a way in which we have to reshape our discipline to consider multiple and non-fixed sort of identities, or is there like how do we go about doing that? So anyway, all of us are waiting to listen to Professor Dominelli. So it's already 7:55. So we hope that Professor Dominelli will deliver the talk for 45 minutes, and then we can have 15 to 20-minute discussion, because Professor Dominelli is also having another class after this lecture. So once again, welcome, ma'am, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. And special thanks to Dr. Jayaraj and Dr. Jose, and apologies if I mispronounced your names. And also, I'm delighted to be here and to see so many people participating in this wonderfully named Aloft. I think it says it all. We're trying to get beyond where we are now with COVID. So congratulations to whoever thought of that wonderful title. And I think the topic, so I'm delighted. I've never been to Kerala. I have been to India, but mainly to New Delhi and to Leh Ladakh. So maybe one day we will be able to do this in person, but
Yes.
For now, I'm delighted we do have the new technologies, which make this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. So I will try to do that here. Just give me a moment and just bear with me. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I will now move to the slides.
Yeah, the PPT is visible now.
Yeah, but I want to try and get to the whole slideshow. So just bear with me a minute. I will get there. I want to show it from the beginning because but it doesn't seem to want to do that for some reason or other. Let me just go to slideshow from beginning, and there we are. Okay, so now you can see the whole of the screen taking up the slideshow. What I'm going to do is to consider how important we have. Am I in the right? No, this is. Yeah, this is correct. I don't know why I've got two slides up here at the moment for some reason or other. I do apologize for this. For some reason or other, it's have to start again with the slideshow. I do apologize for this. I don't normally have this problem, so it's a bit of a worry. I don't know why it's happening. Anyway, I will carry on now. Hopefully we won't have any.
I think if ma'am, you can just go take the next slide clicked. I think that will come on.
No, I know that. It's just that it wasn't showing up on my screen properly. So I was getting a bit worried about what you're seeing. But if you're seeing the whole screen, that's fine. That's where I should be. But what I want to say is that I'm going to be talking about the way in which identities are constantly shifting and changing, and that we have moved away, but not everyone has moved away from unitary concepts of identity to these, what you call the dislocated versions of identity. And I want to start off talking about some of the concepts that underpin our notion of identity, how these change over time. I will give you examples as we go along. I will then try to argue that if we're going to celebrate pluralistic identities, we need to kind of go back to our core values as social workers, which are around the empowering values, because I think it was Dr. Josie was saying earlier on that we all respect people for who they are, and that this is part of giving each human being identity and recognizing their dignity and respecting them for who they are. I wish we were living in a world that did that throughout, but unfortunately, I think within countries and between countries, we have a long way to go yet. So I'm going to be talking about why that is the case and kind of talk about. Could I ask whoever has their mic on to please close it, because I'm getting a lot of interference.
Yeah, hello, please do mute your mic, everybody, so that we can listen.
Thank you. Okay, so identity is important because it defines who we are, who I am, who you are, and who we are, individually and collectively, as individuals in society, within societies, and then globally across the world. And it's because we share a humanity that we can talk about global senses of identity, and where respect and dignity become so important. And we can only understand that if we see identity as a transactional relationship, which we are constantly renewing, reconfiguring, and changing as we interact with each other, negotiate with each other over whatever aspect of identity is. But sadly, since the nation state, so it goes back several hundred years, but since the nation state became the dominant mode of political structuring of societies, nation states were built on the notion of a unitary, fixed, essentialized identity where everyone was the same and you were assimilated into that entity so that you could participate in the benefits of being in that society, whether it was welfare benefits, however they were distributed and defined, and participate in political decision making. or not. And we'll see where people were excluded in those things. But essentially, it's about power relations, and that's why it's transactional, because power relations are about how we negotiate with each other for positions of strength, positions of weaknesses, positions in between. But essentialized identities within the nation state divided everyone into them and us. The us were the ones that were included, the them were excluded and othered. And if you were a part of the excluded identities, then you were denied access to resources. You were also denied access to political participation. And as a result of that, there were what we call oppositional identities that were formed by people who didn't like that situation, who wanted to say, us in the othered categories are also human beings, and we have something to say about being members of this society, especially if they were migrants who had settled in a particular society and still found themselves excluded. And we have, for example, in the US under Black Lives Matter, people complaining that several hundred years after slavery was abolished, they still aren't accepted as equals. So this is really important because that unitary notion of identity has been responsible for some of the biggest atrocities in the world, not just around colonialism and slavery, but also in more recent forms of genocide, like in Nazi Germany with the Jews and the feminists and the communists and anyone who was disapproved of, particularly people with gay identities. And in Rwanda, more recently around ethnic identity as well. The other thing that we need to acknowledge is that in unified notions of identity, women are seen and configured as signifiers of the nation state. And it's one of the reasons why there's such a big emphasis on women as the conveyors of culture, the ones who transmit the socialization of a culture from one generation to another. And we still see these struggles today in, say, for example, in the US, around struggles around women's fertility and bodily integrity, and the recent Roe versus Wade being set back in certain states in the United States. The other thing that I think is really important in terms of opposition to these unitary notions is that we have to acknowledge, and this is important for us as social workers, because we have to work with people's notions of identities and as they define them for themselves and try to move them elsewhere if we think that's appropriate, and they do as well. Otherwise, we are into a failure of practice. And the responses are fourfold, I think, and they're very important because they're different. One is acceptance. And in this one, people accept that they belong to one unitary sense of identity. So, for example, on one level, I certainly accept I am British. There's a unitary identity of Britishness that most of us will argue about, because we'll say, well, I have a slightly different, yes, but we still believe in the rule of law and we still believe in democracy. So we have some elements in common. And that's why I think it's not easy to talk about identity as a linear relationship, because it isn't. We keep constantly shifting and changing depending on the context and depending on who we are talking to. Then there is the other response, which is about accommodation. So people say, well, I accept the general kind of notion of identity as a British person, but I can tinker at the edges and challenge a few things. But on the whole, I accept I live in a democratic society, so I'm not going to challenge the important bits, just the little bits that don't matter. So like what I wear, whether I become aware of punk clothes, for example, or not. And then there is the one that I think unitary notions of identity find really difficult to accommodate in any way. And that is resistance, where people are positing alternative visions of identity and fighting through various means. Some are violent, some are not, some are evolutionary, but they're trying to make their notion of identity a pluralistic notion of identity where everyone becomes accepted because they're different, not because they're the same, and have that an accepted, established practice. And so recently here in the UK, we've had the LGBTQ, the people who are trans people who are arguing about what does it really mean to be a man or a woman, and is that binary sufficient to accommodate the different notions of identity on that dimension, the gender dimension. And so we are still constantly, which is why I think that we will never reach a stage where there's only one view of identity, because I think people will constantly be arguing about what it means and changing their notions of identity. And I'll say more about that in a minute. But also the other response is to escape. So if, and I think situations of armed conflict are really important in this regard. If I feel I cannot accept a dictatorial definition of my identity, then I will try and migrate. And we have the Syrian, at least here in Europe, we have the Syrian refugees who are escaping Bashir al-Assad's definition of what it is to be Syrian. And they're saying, well, we have a different view, so we'll try to escape. But escapism is not new. It has been around for a very long time. And I think that probably in the West, the example that is best known, but nobody thinks about it in these terms, is the Pilgrim so-called fathers, but there were mothers and children with them, leaving Plymouth to go to the US and establish a new colony there, which eventually became the UK, but it was a British colony to begin with. And they did that because their notion of identity as Quakers was very different from the dominant one that was around at that point in time. So that, for me, leads to my saying that culture is a very important definer of identity. So when the Pilgrims left the UK, it was because Protestantism in the form of the Church of England was the dominant religious discourse. The Catholics remained in the UK, but the Pilgrims decided to leave. And others also migrated within the country. So, for example, the Plymouth Brethren moved from the south coast of England to the middle of England, because in those days, this was several hundred years ago, life was very different, and the connections between one part of the UK and another were very limited. So what I'm saying is that culture is really important in terms of how we sense ourselves as a particular identity or another, but there are contested views of what a culture is. And for some of us, a culture is seen as universal and others see it as relative. Others create subcultures, others create completely new cultures. So we have kind of like the unitary notion where culture is fixed and immutable, it never changes. And the other one that is in opposition to it, which sees culture as fluid, dynamic, and constantly changing. And we do have to acknowledge, though, that whatever side of that binary divide we line up on, culture does cover a whole wide range of phenomena, ranging from beliefs, religion, art, music, law, customs, traditions. And they do establish the dominant norms within which unitary notions of identity live within. And those who are seen as different are not accepted. And as Dr. Josie was saying earlier on, they are not seen as belonging to a particular society. And that's what othering is so important about that. It signifies the power of the dominant group to be able to exclude subordinate groups through the othering of their identities and saying, you're not part of us and you don't belong here. And I will be saying more about that in a minute. But cultural changes occur through exchanges with others, the transactionality of culture as well as identity. And different groups and different peoples have always interacted with each other since people migrated out of Africa and went to different parts of the world to colonize it in their own ways. And we do live in societies that will reward the dominant forms of identity and not the subordinate ones. And there are dangers with doing that, like jingoism, which can lead to armed conflict, as it has, like, for example, in the Balkans, where people are saying, we're the only ones who really belong here. The rest of you, we're going to throw you out, or we're going to kill you, or whatever. That's also part of that accommodation that people make. Like, why is it that identities can be living, coexisting for centuries, as they did in the Balkans, the Muslims and the Christians, for centuries. And then suddenly, because some person who wants to create a different kind of society and a monolithic identity decides to fight the others for a piece of ground that they can claim as theirs, we are in a war situation where people have to migrate out or they will be killed. And I don't need to go into all the details of that. Nonetheless, in social work, there still is a struggle between people who acknowledge that there are pluralistic identities, particularly on the cultural and ethnic front, but still see each one of these as monolithic and unitary. And the best example I have is in the US, in the multicultural arena, where Domain Lum has for many decades now argued that each culture is different, but each culture is unitary within itself. And he argues that people can be given, social workers can be given a toolkit that they just take from one place to another and then apply it when they, here's someone who comes from, let's say, Iran. Well, Iranian culture is, and you've got a big long list and you check your list, and that's what you do. But I know, and you know, that someone may come from Iran, but they may have very different views about what kind of a society Iran should be. And that's probably why they're not in Iran, but over in the West. And the other thing is that I think identity is always changing, as I said before, but it has continuities and discontinuities. And it's these continuities and discontinuities within which notions and understandings of culture are embedded, but also our notions of who we are also embedded. And the continuities are based on all those elements that a particular group or cultural entity will share. So like I said before, we share the value of giving people, all human beings, deserve respect and dignity, to be treated with respect and dignity. So that's a continuity. It has gone on for many generations. The discontinuities are linked to changes in identity formation, where I, as a feminist, for example, an anti-racist, criticized social work back in the 1970s and 80s for being unitary and not acknowledging that there were lots of diverse identities within British society. And so what I did at that point was to do research on how social workers saw other people and themselves. So we have to understand transactionality as a relationship between me and you, or me and other people, or me as a social worker and a service user, or me as a community development worker in a community, or even the larger society, and for people like me who work in the international arena with the UN, within that global notion of who we are. And professionally who we are. So identity isn't just about belonging to a particular society. It could be about belonging to a profession. It could be about belonging to a trade union. It could be about belonging to a club. It could be belonging to many different elements of society. And therefore, all of those things affect our sense of identity, and it is context specific. So, for example, why are you listening to me here now? Because I have, as part of my identity, yes, I'm a woman, I'm British, I'm many other things, but I'm also a professor, I'm a teacher. So you are listening to me because you think I have something important to say. Otherwise, you'd say, oh, Lena Dominelli, we don't need to listen to her. So we are all, we hold multiple aspects to our identity, and we emphasize some over others at different times, depending on what the context is. So in this arena, I will talk about my identity as a professor, not my identity as a mother, for example. So we do choose, and this is an important word, which elements of our identity we will emphasize depending on the context, because we're constantly negotiating that sense of identity that we bring to the table. And here's an example of a monolithic view, but still within that binary of the them and us of identity. And this is chosen, I chose this because this is, I got this from Canada when the terrorists suddenly discovered that they could get through the security checks at airports by putting dangerous explosive in bottles. And there was a big hoo-ha when the British discovered this, and then they found that they were also going to Canada. And so the Canadian papers had a field day, kind of like the them and us. Here are the Canadians as a nice, innocent, well, the beaver is the animal representing Canada, which I think is hilarious because it looks a bit not so clever. But anyway, it's the Garden of Innocence, as you can see, and it's multiculturalism. But look at the monster that's coming up through the swamp, yeah? So that is such a powerful image that even though I collected this in 2006 when I was doing research on identity, which I'll mention again in a minute, I thought this just says so much, and it's so powerful because it does pit the us versus them. So the us are all these nice Canadians who are doing what we're told, and we're always obedient, and we always welcome everybody, but we better be careful because we're welcoming people who don't belong here. So it's a very powerful image. But that image led me to a piece of research that ended up in the creation of this chart. Now, I did content analysis in newspapers in England and in Canada for the period of a year. So that's between 2006 and 2007, and came up with these narratives of place and space, which were about identity and how people were accepted or not, depending on the discourse that people subscribe to. So the you don't belong here is the assimilationist discourse that says if you're different and you don't want to be like us, then go away, find somewhere else to be whoever you want to be, but don't do it here in this place. And it's part of the assimilationist approach, which is become like us and then you'll be okay. So whereas this one doesn't accept there's a possibility of change, this one does. And then there's the response to both of these and says, so the people who are being excluded are saying, but we're human beings just like you, so we have a right to be here on the basis of sharing a common humanity. And then at that period, especially in 2007, there was a huge discourse in the US and in Canada about migration and immigration. The two different things, but they overlap. And some people were saying, we don't want any more migrants here. There's too many of them. Of course, everybody knows about Trump and what he did in the States around this issue. But way back in 2007, people were saying similar things, just not as harshly. The people who were being excluded were saying, okay, you label us as immigrants and migrants who don't belong here. Well, we're going to withdraw our labor. And they did. It was called, in the US, it was called Immigration Day. And several sectors of the economy couldn't function because the workers weren't there. They were all on strike. So that was where that came along. You can't get along without us, and it's primarily economic. Then there are others who've been settled for a long time, like, for example, the discourses around Black and Caribbean and African origin people in the US, in Canada, and in the UK, where they say, this is our land too, we're settled here. So go away and don't tell us about where else we belong. We belong here. I was born in Birmingham, so you can't tell me to go back home to wherever my parents or grandparents or great-grandparents came from. And then there's the egalitarian view, which is about let's share this land. We're all here together, so we all have to learn to live with each other, respect each other, our different approaches and cultures, and see them as a source of wealth and richness, not as a source of disruption and loss or a deficit. And I've given you this already, so I'm just going to say that these discourses, you don't just have one, although one may be dominant at one time over another, but all of them coexist at any point in time. And the different dimensions or social divisions that these can occur, and these are not an exhaustive list, they're just some of the dimensions on which it happens: gender, ethnicity, which is often confused with nationality or racial group, age, disability, sexual orientation, mental ill health, class, accent, especially if you're in the UK. I never realized how important an accent was until I started moving around the different regions in the UK. Clothes, what you wear, religion, political ideology. And I think the task for social workers here is not to take this list as conclusive. There are lots of others that I could add to this and have a list longer than my arm, but that the social workers need to endorse identity as pluralistic and valuing diversity, but they have to do that by talking to the people that they're working with to find out what they mean by different notions of culture, identity, who they are, and what artifacts they use and create in expressing their identity. So this is a group of women that I was working with in the Affirming Women project, who were talking about resisting domestic violence in their families and in their intimate relationships. And we had fantastic fun time, actually, trying to find out how we could make this message known and creating a sense of identity around domestic violence that united women, Black and white, across this issue, which we did very successfully, and I've written that up. But I think that what that is saying to me is that people can be excluded on all sorts of dimensions, including violence and domestic violence being one of them. But what social workers need to do is to uphold people's human rights and work with them to make sure that they do get their recognition for their human rights. Because at the moment, if you cross a border, whether it's inside a country, so suddenly, if I cross a border and become a trans person, then all of a sudden I can't go and use the women's bathroom because I'm a trans, so I have to go and use something else. If I'm Black, then there are other areas that I'm excluded from. So I find that some of this can be indirect exclusion, like in the UK. We find that most top jobs are captured by white middle-class men, not even middle-class women, let alone Black men and women. And Marshall, T.H. Marshall in the UK, recognized that we have a lot of rights, and he divided them into three main categories: the civil, the political, and the social. And for social workers, it's the civil and the social that become most important, because those are about our rights to express ourselves under the civil ones, and the social ones around rights to benefits and entitlement to welfare. And for us in the West particularly, these are the bases for human rights. And a lot of people, including me for a long time, but COVID certainly made me realize this is not the case, although I knew it intellectually because I read Hannah Arendt way back I was an undergraduate then in the late 60s, early 70s, where she argued that you should never rely on the state to guarantee your rights, because the state takes sides with those who are in political power or dominance. And it's based on her experiences in Nazi Germany. As a Jew, she was excluded. And she said the only people who can guarantee your rights are other people, the citizenry, the people who are more like you, because they only have the power of relationships that they engage with to actually change things. So that means for us as social workers, we should be looking to how we reduce people's fear of the other, particularly when it's fear of diversity and difference, and encouraging interactions at all levels, at the micro, the meso, and the macro, of people who are different from each other. And I've shown you, and we don't have time, like normally I give this slide to students because I like to challenge them on what their views are. And I ask them to rank their fear of these different people. And usually these two are the ones that are the least feared. This one tends to be the most feared. And I think for me, this is the one I fear most, because I recognize power in somebody's eyes when I see it. So all the students get shocked when I say to them, that's the one I fear most. I've worked with all these others and they're fine. They're human beings just like you and I. So I think that's a very interesting section. But we're constantly negotiating our fears and our sense of the other as either like us or different from us. And so I've drawn up a chart where the center is the complex, interactive negotiations and ethical behavior, because we as social workers are required to behave ethically and do no harm to others. But in terms of identity and whether we go for a fluid, transactional version of identity or a fixed, unitary, centralized version, and I just start with the personal, but I could start anywhere else on this chart. But personal identity is what I think as an individual, my personal values, my personal beliefs. They can be linked to, and that's why the arrows go both ways, to institutional identity formation. So my identity as a professional social worker, the requirement that I adhere to in the UK, the BASWA, British Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics, and also the cultural dimension, which is where my norms and values as society, like the belief in the rule of law, which I think without that, we would be in a real mess because we'd be fighting each other, and democratic decision-making, even if I, as a woman, for a long time didn't get involved in any political decision-making because I really didn't have much time for it. I'm now trying to work my way back into being more engaged with local governments, at least. But it's been quite difficult because of COVID. But identity strikes at the heart of who we are. And we as social workers need to understand the complex ways and the way it goes back and forth to kind of create who it is that we think we're interacting with there. And we have us as the social worker interacting with a community or an individual or a group through our practice in that. Oh, what's happened here? Oh. Interesting. I didn't realize this was true of this bit here. But anyway, it's about recognizing that we all have the right to respect and dignity, and without that, we would all be oppressed. We also have to acknowledge that oppression means exclusion from decision-making and the right to benefits and participation in political structures. And we as social workers can use some tools to help us in trying to include people who are different in the larger body politic. And this includes Articles 22 to 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I don't know how many of you know, but we can use for poverty eradication strategies, because Articles 22 to 27 talk about the right to food, clothing, shelter, education, and health services. So we can use those for people who don't receive those services to argue they have a right to this because all countries have signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And interestingly, I don't know how many of you know this, but 19 social workers were involved with Eleanor Roosevelt when they drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because IASSW, the International Association of Schools of Social Work, which I had the privilege of being president for 8 years in the past, was recognized by the UN and had general consultative status. It still does since 1947. So they were involved. And I think if you read the declaration in its entirety, you can see the social work jargon in it. I certainly could. But it meant that people were given some standard of living that was adequate for them to maintain their well-being. And the newest element to our toolkit of tools that we can use to encourage people to have their rights, to eliminate poverty, to end hunger, to get education, to participate. There's 17 goals. I haven't got time to go into all of them, but they're here listed. And I have said that you're welcome to have these slides so you can look at them. But we as social workers can use all of these, and I have been using a lot of them, and also spoke to these issues in the COP26 meetings. And also when I get to go, because I sometimes represent IASSW in other discussions at the UN as well, so I do that. But these are tools that help us to mobilize communities so that we can enhance their well-being and care for people. And I have added since 2012, care for planet Earth as well and our environment, because without caring for the environment, we will not be able to do all of this, let alone all of that. But these are tools to help us care for the environment, because there are environmental issues like building decent cities and looking after the water and the fish and everything else. So I could talk about these things all day long, but I know I need to move on. So I'm just going to say that what we need to do as social workers, besides using these tools, is to hold the people who make decisions, which exclude people from decision-making, to account for the decisions that they make. So, for example, when we're talking about structural inequalities rooted in our identity, i.e., who we are seen as being by others, who we are configured as being by others, not just by ourselves, but by others, then we should be saying, hang on a minute, this particular approach is excluding these people who are different from the majority, and we have to bring them in, because we live in societies where people are becoming closer and closer to each other, and therefore we need to look at what happens in one country impacting on another. And this is particularly true with the destruction of the environmental green lungs of the world in the Amazonian basin, and in tropical forests and in the temperate forests, which are all burning down in Western Canada and the Northwest US. But at the same time, and this is where the anti-oppression comes in, we have to recognize that culture is locality specific, and that we have to ask each person what culture means to them. Otherwise, we're simply imposing our view of what a culture is rather than adapting to how people see their culture and how they use it in defining themselves. And this becomes really important when we're working with people who've been trafficked and smuggled into countries, migrated into countries for diverse reasons, because migration is bigger than trafficking and smuggling, although you'd never know it from the way the media talks about trafficking and smuggling. And we know that the Geneva Convention excluded women from persecution for their political views or persecution, running away because they were experiencing female genital mutilation, for example, because they were identified as women who had to be pure in order to be married in certain cultures. And so there were loads of women in the 70s and 80s fighting for changes to this convention, so that now escaping female genital mutilation and domestic violence are recognized as covered under the Geneva Convention 1951, which has also brought opposition to that. And I hate to say it, that some members of the current government in the UK want to get rid of it or change it so that they don't have to have recognition of so many rights. And then the other one that I think is really important in terms of identity relates to Indigenous people and the way in which majority cultures have dominated the scene by taking land, resources, water, forests, whatever it is, away from Indigenous people. And the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that the UN made a few years ago is an attempt to kind of like redress that balance. So we need to take all those things into account because they impact on how people think of themselves and who they are, and whether they feel they have the right to ask for help. And what I've found in my research is true is that people who cross borders, and especially women, do not feel they are entitled to rights, and therefore they feel ashamed if they go and ask for any. And so social workers have a big role to play in encouraging women to feel empowered and to ask for their rights, and to highlight how there are some people who are making enormous amounts of money by exploiting women, and trafficking is an example of this because it's worth billions every year. And interestingly, when I did some research on this a couple of years ago, Mauritania, Haiti, and Pakistan had the largest number of modern day slaves, mainly because they had the largest number of women in either forced marriage or forced labor contracts that denied them the right to even hold on to their passport, which is the only way that if you cross a border, you can show who you are. And that's based on nationality, not on your sense of identity that you define it. It's how the state defines it. So there are social workers working in these areas. I've given you the example of the Poppy project in London, but there are many, many of these that work on it. And so we work on the basis of egalitarian values and anti-oppressive practice in order to overcome the fear that I mentioned before. And I think that a lot of people get hung up on the view that values in social work are Western values because in the West, they were based on Kantian principle of respect for and dignity of the person. We later on added social justice and respecting human rights. But as far as I'm concerned, the Eastern societies and cultures also demand recognition of respect for the person and the dignity of the person. So it's not something that Kant developed for himself. I think he probably borrowed the thinking from other people and just didn't acknowledge it. They didn't have intellectual property rights in those days. But even in his day, people traveled between the West and the East quite freely because they didn't even have passports then like we do now. Passports didn't come in until 1850. And so we need to kind of like look at our social justice and the values rooted in social justice, which now include environmental justice, to try and deal with all our concerns about identity. And we have talked about these, so I'm not going to mention them very much, but to highlight that despite the fact that social workers and our Western societies will say, of course, we're for social justice, human rights, equality, inclusion, solidarity, and individual and collective empowerment. But when you look at what they are actually doing, and COVID-19 is a good example of this, I've never been so disillusioned by what my state is doing since ever, except for COVID-19. I have opposed so much of what they've done, but it's because I think there's now a new ethno-nationalism. It's different from the old ethno-nationalism, which was about conquering territories. Now it's about sharing things equitably across the globe, because we live in an interdependent, globalized world where what happens in one place affects what happens in another. And again, COVID has really brought this home, because the new variants are arising in all societies. And because we move around a lot as human beings, even under COVID, we have to have a few more hurdles to overcome to move around under COVID, but people are still doing it. So we get new variants coming in all the time. And the COVID virus, the coronavirus, is smarter than we are, because it is building on the resistances that our vaccines have offered to kind of find ways around it. So we're constantly having to develop new vaccines. And it's all because we, as especially in the West, and that includes the UK, Canada, and the US, particularly in Europe, the European Union, have not shared our vaccines and our knowledge of vaccines with the rest of humanity as a whole. So we have, and Gordon Brown argues this all the time, and he can give you the exact data on this, because he argues we actually have a lot of vaccines that we're not even using that could have been given to people who have none in the global south so that they could be vaccinated, because the best protection all of us have is to be vaccinated against all variants, so that if we're all vaccinated, there won't be anybody that the virus can go to find a new way of getting a new mutation going. So for me, COVID-19 emphasizes the importance of us recognizing our global interdependence as a humanity. And that's where who we are should not be seen in unitary terms. It should be seen as pluralistic, dynamic, and fluid. But we need to supplement that with solidarity and inclusion of the needs of all within the needs of one. We haven't done that yet. And I think social workers can argue for that and persuade people that they need to do this. And so I now have my last slide, which is to conclude my presentation. And it's basically to say that an individual sense of identity exists in many different versions and is fluid and context dependent, as I argued before. And it's our values and ethics that help us to make choices when the them-us binary excludes people, and we see that this is doing harm and we want to do something about it. That's when our strengths as social workers come in, and we can look to our values to overcome the ethical dilemma that being in that predicament creates for us. And I think we have to include environmental justice, which for me at this point in time, because COVID came to us because we went into the animal kingdom and then didn't take any precautions about bringing diseases from that kingdom into the human one. And therefore we had a pandemic that is costing millions of lives and destroying economies as well. And I think that we need to include social justice with environmental justice as part of our value system in applauding diversity in our identity. And if we're going to uphold the principle of doing no harm, which is the most important value that we have in social work, then that means that whoever the person is, it doesn't matter how they define themselves, how others define them, we should make sure that we give them the entitlements and the rights that will secure their health and well-being. Because if we want anyone in our society to contribute to the well-being of our society, we have to look after the individuals, all individuals, however they may be defined identity-wise within that society. And in order to do that, I think you also have to know yourself and your limitations and strengths. And so as a social worker, if I think, oh, I can't do that, then we have to think of, I can't deny a person of a service because I can't do that. So therefore, I have to find someone else who will do that. And the best example I know in the West is a person who is very Christian in their beliefs and behavior will not accept women's right to controlling their bodily integrity. Well, that's fine for them to hold that as a personal view, but they cannot deny people access to services. But if someone is against that on principle, then their obligation can be discharged by finding someone else who will do the provision of that service in their place. And so I always encourage people to find somewhere where the person can get the services that they need in order to live a fulfilling life within our society for being who they are, not who we want to make them become, and assimilate them into a unitary view of identity. And we also have to acknowledge that sometimes our personal values conflict with our professional values, like in the example I've just given you, and that we have a lot of work to do to make sure that we as a world are solidaristic and encourage everyone to share resources equitably. And that means a big job for us at the local, the national, and the international level as social workers. If we're going to really acknowledge the diversity of identity, the fluidity of identity, the transactional nature of identity within a global context where what happens in one place affects what happens in another. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Professor Dominelli. It was a very fitting start to our webinar because you have detailed all the different processes. Actually, Professor Lena Dominelli started with this historical way in which the formation of nation states led to the view of very solitary, unitary, and very fixed sort of identities, which actually resulted in the unequal distribution of resources, because also it created binaries like us and them. And then she went on to so how culture, how different sort of acceptance, assimilation, resistance, all this becomes part of the way in which people try to grapple with the identities, different crime groups. And then also as social workers, what we should be doing, we should not only be challenging this binary understanding of the identity, but also as social workers, we should be directing ourselves towards, upholding human rights values for people, even when we are agreeing upon fixed, non-fixed sort of flux identities in a flux. We have to ensure that the human rights are available to all of us, and also lessen this fear of diversity that is there in the people, which restricts ourselves from transacting with others in multiple ways and fashions. And also something that I found very interesting when she started talking about the tools that are internationally designed and how they cross borders. And like social workers, we might be using those tools in our daily life, but then she also said we have to make those who are making these tools accountable. Like your duty is not just making tools and sending them across the global borders, but also like what you are doing to make sure that these tools make any real changes in the lives of the people. So all these are questions that we heard today, and I'm sure many of you are bursting with questions. So the floor is open. You can either write the questions in the chat box so that I or Professor Domnelli can read it, or you can just raise your hands and we will start the question and session.
Stunned everyone into silence.
Let me ask a question.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, in a democratic society, everybody's respect is protected in a democratic society. And if actually our main theme is dislocation, and if people are dislocated with for development purpose, with adequate compensation, and will there be any claim for the human rights aspect? Have you understood my question?
Are you asking if there are possibilities for people to claim compensation for wrongs done to them on the basis of human rights? Well, of course, we know that Black Lives Matters are asking for compensation, both in the UK and in the US, as former societies that participated in the slave trade. Abraham Lincoln, way back in 1868, promised African Americans 40 acres of land and a mule, which they still haven't got yet. I don't know, 40 acres of land would be worth a fortune in today's society. I don't know how it's going to be resolved, but that is certainly the claim of people who have experienced historical wrongs. Whether that would work for people claiming human rights violations now, like, for example, the people in who have migrated to escape war in Iraq, Iran, Syria, coming to Europe, the fact that people are refusing to let them cross their borders, whether somebody could mount a challenge, a human rights violation challenge on that basis, but whether they get anything, I have no idea. But what I'm arguing for social workers is that we don't need to get involved in those things. We could just say, these people have a right to services. So we take the services angle and we say, we have these services in society. So it's about not excluding them from having access to them. So the issue is about access, not about compensation, which gets round that kind of argument, because I think there would be a lot of polarization, as we're finding in the UK at the moment, following the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in Bristol. Some people, and this is very interesting, I still haven't made sense of it, I need to do a lot more research on it, but some people dumped a statue of Coulston, who was a slave owner. He did a lot of good things as well as being a man who did a lot of bad things, if we can use that terminology. And so they dumped his statue in the river and destroyed parts of the statue. It has now been fished out of the river and it's in some museum somewhere, but they did what here in the UK called damage, because they damaged the statue. And so they were taken to court for criminal damage. But interestingly, they went to court through the normal British procedures. And because our court system is run by juries and they make the decision, the jury acquitted them and said, in the context of the arguments that were going on at the time, they did not commit criminal damage, even though they damaged the statue, because there was a higher good that they were aiming to, which was to say, what was done by Coulston is wrong. But there were other people who were saying, instead of damaging the statue, we need to acknowledge our history and sort of put a plaque next to the statue saying, these were the good things he did. These were the terrible things he did, of which owning slavery and making money out of slavery was the biggest one that Black people have complained about. And then have another statue there about the resistance to that. And we're still arguing about which is the best way forward. But that was a very interesting, and the government did not like that decision at all. So now they're looking at, can we change the law to get rid of juries for criminal damage, which of course has got a reaction against that, because people like me are resisting that. If you have a jury system and the jury, you don't have to like the decision of the jury. The jury has made a decision and that stands. Just like when a judge makes a decision that I don't like, I have to abide by it because it's the rule of law. So I don't know if our government is recognizing the fact that what they are doing fundamentally is challenging the rule of law. And once you do that, you start unraveling of the society, and that is highly dangerous. So I am worried about what is happening in our situation at the moment. We have an authoritarian government that seems to think that all they need to do is change the law, and any authoritarian action they want to also reduce our right to protest. So again, there's lots of resistance to that. And they're all part of our human rights, or the right to self-expression, to resistance when we don't agree with things. But we have to take the consequences. So if the jury had said, we have to kind of like do things differently and charge them to pay for repairing the statue, then that would have been the decision of the jury. It wasn't, and you can't just pick and choose which ones you want. So thank you for that question. I realize that the time is marching on, and I can only agree to one more question because I have a session at 3:30.
And there are two more questions in the chat box. So I will read the first one. With this, in social work profession, what are the crises that we face while trying to ensure cultural diversity?
The crisis we face, well, I think that depends on your society. In the UK, the crisis we face is the lack of resources and the lack of services to give everyone. When we make an assessment, we don't have the resources to meet that assessment. And that's the crisis for us. And the next question about what should the role of social workers in Afghanistan be? Well, the refugees are not in Afghanistan because they're in their own countries. They're outside of the country to be called a refugee. Within the country, there are a lot of NGOs who are providing basic humanitarian aid, food, clothing, medicine, shelter in some situations, but it's not enough. And there's a big challenge to the international community to provide enough money to buy enough food for 23 million, I think it is, Afghanis within the country, and then to help countries like Afghanistan, who have the bulk of the refugees in their country because they're just across the border, to overdo that as well so that they can respond to that. And I think I've got to stop there because I've got to go to my students, and I'm sorry about that.
Yeah.
The disadvantage of being on
It was
Yes.
really a good treat to everyone who has listened to you. So we really obliged you, ma'am, because it's a treasure we all really engaged with, and your concerns of identity beyond the nationality is something which we really value.
Yeah.
It was great.
Thank you very much for
listening. And also we, like, I remember you saying that you have never visited Kerala.
We
so
really
definitely,
like
after
you.
once this threat is over, you should come over to our institution.
Once really, I have written to you as the president of the Association of Schools of Social Work in Kerala regarding a program.
Thank you very much. I hope so. And I just want to thank you all for making this possible. And I hope you've enjoyed it and something from me. And I'm so sorry that I have to cut the discussion short. But
okay, we acknowledge it, ma'am.
Okay, bye. Thank you.
Anyway, it was really great to be with us.
Thank you. Thank you all for participating. Bye for now.
Bye.
I'll go to Manu. Should we continue the discussion, or should we go to Manu?
No, I think like people are leaving right now.
Yeah. Okay. We will go to the.
We'll go to the and we can continue these discussions in the
after this.
That means,
also
from the coming sessions. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Definitely. Yeah. So, Amrita.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Professor Lena and Dr. Reshma. That was a wonderful talk. It was nice to hear from you both. Please listen. Here on feedbacks. I would like to invite Rika to do the thanks.
Hello, Manu. Just one moment. There is a feedback form given in the chat box. So please, before leaving, do fill that feedback form.
Yes, ma'am.
Manu, you can continue.
Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Dr. MK Jayaraj, Resource Person of the Day, Professor Lena Dominelli, respected Professor and Head of the Department, Dr. Jules Anthony, the Coordinator of the webinar, Assistant Professor Dr. Reshma Bharadwaj, all our faculty members, other distinguished invitees of this mega event. A pleasant evening to one and all. You have been virtually witnessing a very absorbing webinar, Aloft, on the topic Dislocations and Fragmented Identities. With a heart full of joy, I am here to propose the vote of thanks on this auspicious occasion. Professor Dr. MK Jayaraj, the Honorable Vice Chancellor, was gracious enough to accept our invitation to inaugurate this mega event and had enlightened us with his edifying address. On behalf of all gathered here, may I place on record our gratitude to you, dear sir. A big thanks to you, dear Professor Dr. Jules Anthony, for your great support and whose vision is engineering the future of the Department of Social Work. We have been very fortunate to have the dynamic resource person, Professor Lena Dominelli. Hats off to her for spearheading several pioneering initiatives. Thank you, ma'am, for your fruitful keynote address. Thank you, dear Assistant Professor Dr. Reshma Bharadwaj, for moderating this session. Genuine sentiments of gratitude are conveyed to all our dear faculty members of the department who constituted this impressive assembly. My friends also have made this webinar a reality, need to be congratulated for their great effort. Words of appreciation are extended to Ms. Amrita and Ms. Safa, who made this gathering a very special one in their own special ways. Once again, on behalf of myself and all my dear friends, let me offer my profound gratitude to each one of you present here. Thank you all. Have a pleasant evening.
Okay.
Thank you, Manu. It was a pleasure to have you all with us. Ma'am, please.
No, so I think we will conclude this session and hope that in future sessions we'll have more time for very active interactions.
Reshma, we will be having our next session on February
1st.
1st. Yeah.
February 1st.
Yeah.
So like if any of you desire to present your papers in this webinar, we can accommodate two more days of for you to
Have
send
your
your
abstract.
proposal, propose abstracts.
So thanks everyone. It was a really good session. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Thank
So this
you,
concludes the inaugural session of the webinar. Thank you all for attending. We hope you have enjoyed this and welcome you all for the continuing sessions of Aloft from 1st to 4th of February. Thank you. Thank you all.
Yeah, good.